Dr. Jibran, welcome to Let the Quran Speak.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Now, Dr. Jibran, when should a parent begin to have a conversation about drug use with their children?
So this is something that I think, and I'll speak about it from my own context. I think we should start early and speak about it often and do it as it is developmentally appropriate. And what we're seeing at a population level is that there have been consistent reductions in the age of onset for substance use. So vaping, these days, grade 8 is probably even too late.
Oh, wow,
and so
okay.
The earlier you can start, the better it is. And that's, if you think about it from the context of the risk for developing a substance use disorder later on in life, the earlier you start, the greater the risk. The later you start, the lesser the risk. Mm-hmm. And so it's that window of opportunity that you have to delay it as much as possible so that you're reducing that risk of it eventually turning into a substance use disorder later on in life.
Now, how do you have this conversation? What do you say to your children? Because we know that, in the Quran, alcohol is forbidden, but it doesn't talk about the other drugs that people are using these days.
Yeah, and so this is why it's important to take the Quranic message and derive the lesson from it that's then applicable to the other drug classes. What was the drug at that time? What was the intoxicant, as it's referred to in the Quran, was alcohol. Mm-hmm. But the word that's used there is the word intoxicant, something that covers the mind. And so that is the definition that we use, not the literal definition of the word for alcohol being the same word as the word for intoxicant. And so now what we need to do is develop our understanding. So, what we should be doing is for the Quranic scholars to be having conversations with the experts in addiction, for example, and understanding what the effects of each of those drugs are on the mind. And so there have been, for example, differences in the scholarship that have talked about an intoxicant versus a narcotic. Mm-hmm. And while an intoxicant may be impermissible at all times, a narcotic might not be, like opioids for pain management. Mm-hmm. And so there is that distinction that is important to make. But as far as talking to the kids about it, there are toolkits that, for example, when cannabis got legalized in Canada, the government of Canada produced a great toolkit that, the Canadian Council on Substance Abuse and others have done very great initiatives for us to reduce the harm associated with substance use in young children. And so these toolkits are great, and us as Muslims, we can also use them and benefit from them. And so I would suggest and recommend that anybody, it can be easily found on Google, and you find those toolkits and use some of those tools to adapt to talk about it in the Muslim context. What you're doing is you're maintaining you're going to take whatever you get from those toolkits, and then you're adding an additional layer of the Islamic context on top of that. Mm-hmm. And so very much like how the Quran took the approach with alcohol as well.
Tell us about the approach of the Quran.
Yeah, so Aisha, may Allah be pleased with her, may God be pleased with her, she narrates a statement that if the first thing that came in the Quran was that do not drink alcohol or do not fornicate, the people would have said, no, we will never leave the alcohol or fornication. Instead, what was worked on by the Quran was the belief, and once the belief was set, then those rulings that came down. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, us as parents have a difficult time having the talk with our kids. We don't have the talk about fornication or alcohol. Mm-hmm. And the only time maybe it'll come up is on the drive when you're going to drop them off to their dorm room at the university, and it's like, don't have sex and don't drink alcohol. And that's usually where that talk stops. Mm-hmm. But if we even go back 1,400 years, Aisha, she is saying, may God be pleased with her, that wouldn't have worked then. So how do we expect it to work in 2020? Mm-hmm.
And it seems like in the Quran, God is having a talk with us as well about how to...
So the stepwise approach the Quran takes, it starts off by first talking about that, the food and even the drink that's made from the food is permissible for you. Mm-hmm. Then it goes on to say that while there is some benefit in alcohol, there is also cons. So there is also detriment. And so the pros and cons are talked about, and that's very much almost exactly the same as what the toolkits do, is they talk about the pros and the cons. You know, increased sociability, you might have more friends, you might be able to, it's a social lubricant, alcohol, for example. And so you might be able to be more popular at a party. And so that might be the pro. But then there's the cons. And then we can talk about the effects on the developing brain, something that we study in our lab, for example. It's, you know, we look at the long-term effects of even short or brief exposures to drugs like alcohol, cannabis, or nicotine during adolescence, and what the long-term ramifications of that can be. And so
tell me about that a little bit more, because I haven't thought about that.
Yeah, so there is, you know, longitudinal studies, for example, that are done in adolescence. And they sort of show three major domains in which the impact can be seen. So if somebody uses a substance during adolescence, and most commonly used substances sort of oscillate between, right now it's cannabis and alcohol, but before it was nicotine, and now nicotine is going to make a comeback because of vaping. And so, but those are the big three that are used in adolescence. And the three domains that the long-term effects can be seen in are psychopathology, so increases in everything from risk for schizophrenia, anxiety, depression, and you know that's part of the research we do in the lab. Is it's a chicken or egg question. You don't know what was going to lead to what, which came first, or even though the substance use almost always comes first because that's what's developmentally appropriate, right? So it's usually a teenager that'll start using drugs, but then when they turn 18, that's when they'll get schizophrenia. Schizophrenia isn't necessarily going to come earlier than that. So that might make us think that there's a causal direction one way, but that's some of the research that's ongoing right now, is trying to figure out that chicken or egg question. But so some of it is in the domain of psychopathology, so increased risk for anxiety, depression, schizophrenia. Another is in the domain of cognitive dysfunction, so changes in IQ, changes in working memory, changes in school performance, for example. And once again, it's not causal, but then we're able to use preclinical studies to be able to answer some of those questions causally. And then the last one is future risk for substance use. So the earlier you start, the more drugs that you do in terms of co-use of substances. So not just in adolescence, what is most common is that not just one drug is used, but more than one drug is used at the same time. And so that then also further increases your risk for having a substance use disorder later on in life. And so those are some of the long-term consequences. But then there are sort of the short-term consequences as well. One of the risks or dangers, especially both in the context of alcohol and cannabis, but especially when they're used together, is a risk for impaired driving. And so there is that problem that, you know, that can directly affect their life or somebody else's life.
So, that's the most important part.
And that's where, those are the important conversations to have. And that's why when you think about the next step, even when the Quran did, so there was one step in between, and we'll talk about it in a second, but the final step, when the Quran prohibited alcohol, it then put it into context of other things that are also prohibited and that are bad at a societal level. So gambling, for example. And so that's when it came down as this is from the actions of the devil, for example, and that's when you were told to leave it behind and to stay away from it. But that, it put it into context of the other potential negative ramifications or other things that can have negative effects at a societal level. It was put into context of that so that it wouldn't just be a single thing being talked about to stay away from. And you could then draw connections and also liken it to the ills that might come from gambling. And so that you could put it into context and understand that. But the step that came before it was where God talks to us, or talks to the believers in the Quran, that do not go close to prayer when you are intoxicated, when you have drank alcohol, for example. until you know what you are saying. And that's so once you've talked about the pros and cons with your kids at the neuroscience level or at the developmental level, then you can take it up another level if your child is at the age and is thinking about it, is that not only is it having an effect on your physical existence, both on your brain or your ability to drive or interact with people or any of that, and your risk for mental illness, but then it has an impact on your spiritual existence as well. And that you will not be able to have those conversations with your God that you might have been able to have before if you weren't intoxicated. Mm-hmm. And so that's that stepwise approach, I think, in the Quran that's used for alcohol could be very useful in talking to our children about substance use. Mm-hmm.
Now, Dr. Jibran, this involves a lot of thinking and a lot of understanding about how drugs work and how they interact with our bodies, which many parents might not have.
Yeah.
So would you recommend they read up on it?
Yeah. So, unfortunately, and this is something I saw at a personal level, as soon as legalization came in, I started being invited to different masajid, different centers, different schools to come and talk about this, right? And the problem was that October 17th, 2018 wasn't the day that magically, you would go from no Muslims using cannabis to now all the Muslim kids using cannabis. If I think back to my own high school experience, I can think of quite a few Muslim kids that were using it back then, and that was a long time ago, right? So what I think what we all need to do as parents is educate ourselves and find access in, conversations like this are important, but, there are lots of experts available. We have the internet available to us and, great resources like the Canadian Council on Substance Abuse that have resources available online that are very easy to understand. And they don't, maybe some of the words I used were academic, but they have lay versions of these documents that then allow you to get a good sense of what each of these drugs are, what you may or may not have seen with your kids already. Like, at 10, 11, 12 a.m., if you're seeing somebody going into your pantry and eating all of the chips, that might be a sign, redness in the eyes. Substance abuse. Potentially, of the munchies, for example. If all the snacks that you always buy are always gone, and yes, some of it is related to, growing up and growing children having caloric needs, but some of that can also be an indication. These days, especially with vaping devices, before the telltale sign was the smell of cannabis, right? Mm-hmm. With the Cannabis 3.0, that's not the case anymore when it comes to cannabis oils or isolates or concentrates, which don't even have that characteristic smell. So it's important to stay involved. It's important to have those conversations. And, this is why it's important for us to be having conversations with our kids from a very young age, because you can't just, when they're 10, 13, or 14, be like, come, sit down, son, and let's talk about things when we've never talked about before, because then the child's going to be like, what did I do wrong? And so there is a lot of talking that we need to be having from a very young age, get them to be comfortable to come to you the first time they see substances at school. That I saw somebody vaping. What is that? And so that's what I'm hoping for, at least with my boys, is that they can come and talk to me the first time they see it and ask me the question instead of having to find out about it from their friends or the internet.
I hope so too, Dr. Jibran. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you.